The coldest night anyone in the kingdom could remember did not begin with a storm. It began with silence. The kind of silence that wraps around a crowd when no one dares breathe. Snow fell slowly across the palace courtyard, soft, almost gentle, as if the sky itself could not believe what was happening below. Torches lined the stone walls, flickering violently against the wind, casting long shadows across the faces of thousands who had gathered without being summoned. They simply came. Because when a king does something unthinkable, people cannot look away. Soldiers moved in formation through the crowd, their boots crunching against the frozen ground, their faces hidden beneath iron helmets. And between them, dragged forward with shaking hands and unsteady feet, was a woman, not a criminal, not a traitor, a pregnant woman. Her dark hair whipped across her face in the wind. Her thin cloak offered almost nothing against the cold. And with every stumbling step she took toward the iron gates, her hands pressed tightly against her stomach, instinctively, desperately, protecting the only life she still had the power to shield. Her name was Elara, and until 3 days ago, she had been the most beloved woman in the entire kingdom, the Alpha King's chosen mate, the woman the people called the heart behind the crown. Now she was being thrown into the winter wilderness to die. At the top of the palace stairs, King Lucian stood completely still, no emotion on his face, no hesitation in his posture, just the cold, composed expression of a man who had already made his decision and refused to let anyone, including himself, question it. Elara turned her head toward him one final time. Her lips moved. The wind swallowed most of her words, but those standing close enough would later whisper that she said only this: "Not for me, please, for the child." The king looked away, the gates opened, and the winter wind screamed through that courtyard like something ancient and furious, like the world itself was protesting what no one inside those walls had the courage to stop. Elara stumbled forward into the darkness. The gates slammed shut behind her, and the kingdom told itself it had done the right thing. They were wrong, because 5 years later, when famine emptied the villages and enemy armies circled the borders like wolves waiting for the weakest moment to strike, salvation would not come from the throne room. It would not come from the warriors or the nobles or the advisors who watched silently that night and said nothing. It would come walking through those same gates on small, determined feet. A boy with no crown, no army, and no fear. A boy carrying a worn wolf pendant and eyes identical to the king who never knew he existed. And by the time King Lucien understood what his pride had cost him, the question would no longer be whether he deserved to be saved. The question would be whether it was already too late. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. 5 years before that boy walked through the palace gates, no one questioned the king's decision. Not publicly, not loudly, not in any way that mattered. Because the accusation against Elara had been presented with terrifying precision: treason. The royal council announced it at dawn, before most of the palace had even risen. Servants heard it first, whispered through corridors and kitchens and cold stone hallways. And by midday, the entire capital had decided Elara was guilty. The evidence seemed overwhelming. A witness came forward, claiming he had seen her slipping beyond the eastern walls after midnight, moving through the shadows toward the northern ridge where enemy messengers were known to travel. 3 separate guards confirmed unusual movement near her chambers on nights when the king was away in council. And then came the final blow, the one that sealed her fate before she even had a chance to speak. A silver dagger was discovered, hidden beneath the floorboards of her private room. It was not just any dagger. It bore the crest of the Valdrin kingdom, the most dangerous enemy the Alpha Throne had ever faced. The crowd in the throne room erupted. The nobles demanded blood. The warriors demanded exile. And the king, surrounded on all sides by rage and judgment and the suffocating pressure of public opinion, looked at the woman he once loved and saw only what everyone else was telling him to see. But there was one truth buried beneath all of it, one truth that no one in that throne room knew. Every piece of that evidence had been carefully, deliberately, expertly constructed, not by an enemy beyond the mountains, by someone standing inside the palace walls, someone who smiled when the gates closed on Elara, someone who had spent years quietly positioning himself for exactly this moment. His name was General Vylor, the king's most trusted advisor, the man who had stood at Lucien's right hand since before the crown was placed on his head, the man who had, for years, been selling the kingdom's future to the highest bidder, and the one person who understood that as long as Elara was alive, as long as she stood beside the king with her quiet wisdom and her ability to see through pretense, his plans would never fully succeed. So he removed her, not with a blade, with words, with evidence, with the oldest weapon in the world. A lie told loudly enough, in front of enough people, at exactly the right moment. The questions that haunted everything that followed were simple. Would the truth survive long enough to matter? Would the king ever realize what his pride had blinded him to? And what exactly had Elara seen the night before her arrest? The thing that made her dangerous enough to destroy? The answers to all of those questions began long before the exile. They began where most great tragedies begin, with love. King Lucien had not always been the man who stood cold-eyed at the top of those stairs. There was a version of him, not so long ago, really, that the people genuinely adored. Before the crown, before the council, before the weight of a kingdom settled across his shoulders and slowly bent him into someone harder, colder, less forgiving of anything that looked like softness. He had been known in those earlier years as the young Alpha who rode out personally to defend border villages when raiders threatened. Not because his generals told him to, because he could not sit still inside the palace walls while people were suffering within his territory. He had been known for remembering the names of soldiers who served beneath him, not just the commanders, but the youngest recruits, the ones who arrived nervous and uncertain, still learning how to hold a weapon. He had been known for laughing, genuinely, freely, the kind of laugh that surprised people the first time they heard it, because it belonged to someone real, not a symbol. And Elara had loved that version of him with everything she had. She was not born into nobility. Her family came from a small river settlement 3 days' ride from the capital. Honest people, hard-working people, the kind who measured wealth in harvests and warmth rather than title or land. She had come to the palace as a young woman, working in the gardens that lined the eastern wing, and the first time Lucien ever noticed her, she had been arguing, quietly but firmly, with a senior steward who had refused to give winter supplies to a family of servants whose quarters had flooded. She was not yelling. She was not threatening. She was simply, calmly, completely refusing to accept that cruelty was the correct response. Lucien watched the entire exchange from a second-floor window. He did not intervene. He did not need to. She won. And he found himself returning to that same window the following morning, and the morning after that, until he eventually ran out of reasons not to simply go down and introduce himself. What followed was not the swift, dramatic kind of love that stories usually celebrate. It was the slower, quieter, more honest kind. The kind built from long conversations that stretched past midnight. From learning each other's fears, not to use them against one another, but to understand where the other person needed gentleness. From disagreements that led to deeper understanding rather than lasting wounds. Elara saw through the alpha in him immediately, the dominance, the authority, the instinct to project strength above all else, and she did not flinch from it. She simply responded to the person beneath it. And Lucien, for perhaps the first time in his life, felt genuinely known. He brought her to the moon tree, the ancient silver birch at the center of the royal forest where alpha rulers had been crowned for generations, and in the soft snowfall of an early winter evening, with no audience, no ceremony, no political calculation, he made her a promise. No matter what happens, he told her, his voice low and certain, I will always choose you. She had cried, not from sadness, from the rare, overwhelming relief of being chosen not for what you represent, but for exactly who you are. At that moment, she believed him completely, but the crown arrived, and with it came everything that love, on its own, cannot fully withstand. The council was relentless from the beginning. Older men, powerful men, men who had navigated royal courts for decades and understood precisely how to shape a new king's thinking before he developed the confidence to resist them. They questioned every decision he made that bore Elara's influence. When he extended food relief to struggling villages, something she had quietly suggested after returning from the eastern settlements, the council called it financial weakness. When he listened to her counsel on a trade dispute and chose diplomacy over force, the senior lords gathered privately and whispered that the king was being guided by a woman with no political experience and no noble blood. And General Valor, smooth, patient, methodical, began feeding those whispers with careful, precisely chosen words. He never spoke against Elara directly. He was too intelligent for that. Instead, he planted questions. A ruler who relies on a single voice risks narrowing his perspective, Your Majesty. The people respect strength, and strength requires decisions made from reason, not affection. History remembers kings who kept their personal lives separate from their kingdoms, and it remembers the ones who did not. One sentence at a time, one carefully constructed doubt at a time, and Lucien, surrounded by this constant low-frequency pressure, began to change in ways he could not even feel happening. He started canceling the quiet evening walks he and Elara had always taken through the palace gardens. He began interrupting her in counsel, not aggressively, but with a slight impatience that had not existed before. He stopped sharing his fears with her at night, retreating instead into silence that she could not find a way through. Elara noticed everything. She was not the kind of woman who mistook distance for busyness or silence for peace. She felt the growing cold between them, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. In the pressure, in the stillness, in something shifting at a level beneath what the eye can see. She stayed, because she understood that crowns are heavy and the people who wear them sometimes crush the parts of themselves they cannot afford to show. She stayed because she believed, because she had to believe, that the man beneath the king still existed, and that patience and love were worth more than the comfort of walking away. And she stayed because she had discovered, on a quiet morning 6 weeks before everything fell apart, that she was carrying his child. She had not told him yet. She was waiting for the right moment, the kind of moment that had become increasingly rare, a moment of genuine softness, of the old Lucien surfacing through the armor the crown had built around him. She never got that moment, because the night before she planned to tell him, everything collapsed. She had been unable to sleep. A restlessness she could not explain had pulled her out of bed and down through the eastern corridor toward the archive library. A habit she had developed during anxious nights, surrounding herself with books and quiet until her mind settled. She was passing through the lower gallery when she heard voices, low, urgent, coming from behind the heavy door of the war planning chamber, the chamber that should have been empty at that hour. She would have kept walking. She almost did. But one word stopped her cold. A name. The name of the enemy kingdom's supreme commander, spoken in a tone of familiarity that had no business existing inside those walls. She pressed herself against the stone and listened. What she heard in the next 4 minutes would have brought down an empire. General Valor, the king's most trusted advisor, the man who had pledged his life to the protection of the throne, was arranging the systematic weakening of every alliance the kingdom held. Supply routes that would fail at critical moments, border patrol, schedules that would be conveniently shared, and a timeline. A specific, calculated timeline for when the kingdom would be vulnerable enough that an outside force could move in without significant resistance. Elara pressed a hand over her mouth. Her heart was hammering so loudly she was terrified they would hear it. She turned to run, and as she turned, her shoulder caught the stone edge of a wall bracket. A small sound, barely anything. But in the silence of that corridor, it was enough. The chamber door opened, and General Valor looked directly at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that has nothing warm in it at all. "Lady Elara," he said softly, "you should be resting." She did not sleep that night, and she never got the chance to tell anyone what she had heard. Because by morning, the accusations had already begun. The arrest happened with surgical speed. Elara had barely risen when she heard the guards outside her door. Not the usual quiet post, but a cluster of them, armed and formal. Her first instinct was the child. Her hand went immediately to her stomach, pressing flat against it as though she could hide the truth of what was growing there through sheer will. The guards did not touch her roughly. That was almost worse. The polite, impersonal efficiency of it, as if she were not a person being walked toward judgment, but simply a problem being quietly relocated. The throne room was already full. Every noble family with standing had been summoned. The senior council occupied their carved seats along the eastern wall. Warriors in full ceremonial armor lined the hall from entrance to throne. And at the front of the room, behind a table bearing a velvet cloth, sat the evidence that was about to define the rest of her life. The silver dagger with the Valdrin crest. Elara saw it the moment she entered. She also saw, with sickening clarity, that she had already been tried, not in any formal sense, but in every expression around that room, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the tight mouths, the way certain women who had once embraced her in the gardens now stared at the floor. The verdict had already been quietly reached before a single word was spoken. Only Lucien's face was unreadable. He sat on the throne and looked at her, and for one suspended moment, she thought she saw something. A flicker, a question, the ghost of the man who had stood with her beneath the moon tree. Then Vailor stepped forward. He presented the evidence with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed every word but did not need the rehearsal. The witness testimony, the guard reports, the discovery of the dagger, each piece placed carefully before the king, like stones building a wall. When Vailor finished, the room was completely silent. Lucien turned to Elara. "Tell me the truth," he said. His voice was measured, controlled, but she heard something underneath it, something fighting to stay buried. She looked at him directly. "I would never betray you," she said. "Not you, not this kingdom. What I heard last night in the lower gallery, it was not me planning against you. It was someone far closer to you than I have ever been." She saw his jaw tighten. "The dagger was not mine. The witness is lying. And the man who orchestrated all of this is standing in this room right now." A ripple moved through the crowd. Vailor did not react. He simply turned to the king with an expression of practiced, sorrowful patience. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "there is nothing more painful than discovering that someone we love has deceived us. I take no pleasure in this." The words were measured, compassionate, devastating, because they were not addressed to Elara. They were addressed to the room, and the room absorbed them. Lucien sat very still. Elara could see the war happening behind his eyes. Loyalty against logic, love against fear. The man he was against the king he believed he had to be. Then one of the senior lords stood. "The evidence is clear," he said. "The kingdom demands the Alpha King act with strength." Another voice joined from the opposite wall. "The people are watching, Your Majesty." And another, until the room was a wall of pressure leaning toward a single conclusion. And Lucien, proud, burdened, surrounded, and slowly suffocating beneath the weight of a crown he had never been taught to carry with vulnerability, made the decision that would haunt every remaining year of his life. "Exile her," he said. 2 words, quiet enough that those at the back of the room had to ask what was said, but loud enough to shatter everything. Elara did not cry out. She did not beg. She had one moment, one single moment before the guards moved toward her, where she held his gaze and willed him to hear what she could not say aloud in front of all these witnesses. But his eyes dropped. And that was the answer she had been dreading since the moment she walked through the door. As the guards guided her toward the gates, she placed both hands over her stomach. Not a gesture of fear, a gesture of protection. Because she had already understood something that the king and his council and his advisors and his witnesses had not yet realized. She was not just one person walking out of those gates. She was 2. And whatever happened to her after those doors closed, whatever the wilderness and the cold and the night had in store, her child was coming into the world, whether the kingdom acknowledged it or not. The gates opened. The wind hit her like a physical blow. She did not look back. Because looking back at a man who had just chosen his pride over her life would have broken the last piece of her strength, and she needed every piece she had. The gates closed, the crowd dispersed, and inside the palace, General Valor allowed himself exactly one quiet moment of satisfaction before returning to the controlled, loyal expression he had perfected over decades. The greatest obstacle to his plans had just been removed. Everything else, he believed, was simply a matter of time. He was wrong about that, but he would not discover how wrong for another 5 years. The storm that followed was one of the worst in living memory. Those who survived it would describe it later as something that felt personal, as if the sky had chosen that particular night to express something no human in the kingdom was willing to say aloud. Elara moved through it in a state that was not quite conscious thought and not quite pure instinct. She knew the northern forest, not well. No one knew it well because no one who entered its deeper sections ever reliably returned. But she knew its edges from years of watching it from the palace's upper terraces, and she knew that the winter wind always moved differently near the tree line, slightly calmer in the shelter of the ancient trunks. She moved toward it. Each step was a negotiation between her body and her will. The cold pressed in from every direction. Her cloak, never designed for the open wilderness, offered warmth the way paper offers shelter from rain. Her feet stopped feeling precise things and started communicating only in blunt signals. Cold, wet, heavy, cold. She kept moving. Not because she was not afraid, she was terrified. But fear, she had learned, is not the opposite of action. It is simply a companion you bring along. The contractions, still distant, still warning rather than demanding, reminded her with every cluster of steps exactly what she was carrying, exactly who was depending on her legs continuing to move. At some point, she could not have said how long after leaving the gates, her knees gave way. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. They simply stopped holding her. She went down into the snow on both hands, the cold of it shocking even through her numbness. She stayed there for what might have been a minute or might have been 10. The storm pressed down. The trees around her shifted and moaned. And in that moment, in the dark and the cold and the total isolation of a woman who had been discarded by an entire kingdom, Elara did something that required more courage than anything she had ever done inside palace walls. She refused to stop, not with any grand speech, not with any dramatic declaration. She simply, slowly, painfully, stubbornly got back to her feet. And then she saw the light, a single lantern, amber and wavering in the distance, weaving between the trunks of trees ahead of her, moving toward her. She would later say she did not decide to move toward it. Her body simply turned and followed as if it had made the decision independently. The lantern grew, and from behind it emerged an old woman, small, wrapped in layered furs that made her look wider than she was tall, moving through the drifting snow with a certainty that did not belong to someone stumbling around in a storm. She moved, like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Because she did. She had been going there for an hour. She stopped 2 feet from Elara and held the lantern up between them. Her eyes were silver, not gray, not pale blue, silver, the color of moonlight on still water. And they assessed Elara with a calm, thorough attention that had nothing clinical about it. It was the gaze of someone reading not just what was visible, but everything underneath. "I wondered," the old woman said, her voice low and certain, completely unaffected by the storm around them, "when the moon goddess would finally bring you to my door." Elara had enough strength left for exactly one response. "Please," she whispered. The woman nodded once. "Come." and she turned back into the trees. Elara followed. The cabin existed in the kind of place that maps do not bother to mark, not because cartographers had missed it, but because something about that hollow in the mountain forest seemed to quietly resist being found by people who were not meant to find it. It was small, but deep, built into the hillside as much as upon it, with walls that had been reinforced so many times over so many generations that they had become something closer to stone than wood. Inside, the fire was already burning, as if it had been lit in anticipation. Elara collapsed onto the low bed near the hearth, and the old woman, who told her, without being asked, that her name was Maeve, worked around her with the focused quiet of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Warm water, broth, dry wool blankets that smelled of dried herbs Elara could not identify. She did not ask questions, neither did Maeve, not that first night. But in the days that followed, as the storm outside slowly exhausted itself and the world became quieter, and Elara's body remembered that it was capable of warmth, Maeve began to speak. Not about herself, about Elara, about the child. The first time Maeve pressed careful hands against Elara's stomach, checking the position, the movement, the quiet rhythmic reassurance of a strong heartbeat. Her hands went still, her silver eyes narrowed, not in alarm exactly, and something closer to recognition. "The child carries the mark," she said. Elara's eyes opened. "What mark?" Maeve was quiet for a long moment. "There is a time for that answer," she said, finally. "This is not it." It was not a dismissal. It was a boundary. And something in Maeve's tone told Elara that pressing past it would not produce the truth any faster. It would only produce an incomplete version of it, spoken before she was strong enough to hold it properly. So she waited. 3 weeks later, in the full dark of a winter night, with snow pressing against the cabin windows, Cale was born. There were no royal physicians, no silk-draped beds, no ceremony or announcement, just Maeve's sure hands, the fire's steady light, and Elara's voice, low and private and fierce, talking her child into the world. He arrived quietly, not the loud, protesting entrance of most newborns. He arrived with his eyes already open, silver like his father's, like nothing else Elara had ever seen on a newborn face. Maeve wrapped him carefully and placed him in his mother's arms. And then she said something that Elara would spend the next 5 years turning over and over in her mind, like a stone she could not put down. "He is already marked," Maeve whispered, touching one small hand with a single careful finger. "The Moon Guardians chose his line 3 generations ago. But this child, this one specifically, carries something we have not seen in a very long time." Elara looked up. "Is he in danger?" "He will be," Maeve said plainly. "When the world discovers he exists." "Then the world will not discover it." Maeve looked at her for a long, complicated moment. "You cannot hold the tide back forever," she said, "but you can decide how he meets it when it comes." That became the whole of Elara's project for the next 5 years. Not surviving, not rebuilding, not healing, though all of those things happened as well. Deciding who her son would be when the tide arrived. The village beyond Maeve's cabin was small, 15 families, perhaps 20, living in the folds of the mountain in the organized, interdependent way of people who understand that isolation requires cooperation to survive. They were not naive people. They had seen exiles before. They had sheltered those the capital had, discarded, and watched some of those people arrive bitter and leave bitter and give their bitterness to every surface they touched, Elara was not like that. Not because she was not hurt. She was hurt in ways that did not have clean names, in ways that surfaced without warning in the middle of ordinary moments. The sight of a crown emblem on a passing trader's cart. The particular quality of winter wind through a gap in the cabin walls. The way a formal, controlled voice could, for just a moment, sound exactly like someone she had loved. She was hurt, but she did not feed it to her son. She made a very deliberate, very difficult, very daily decision not to. She told Kale about the world with honesty, about its beauty and its cruelty, and the way those two things are rarely as separate as people wish they were. She told him about the kingdom not with bitterness, but with the careful neutrality of someone describing a place they once loved and no longer entirely recognize. She told him about loyalty and what it requires. She told him about courage and how it is different from the absence of fear. She told him about mercy, especially mercy, and why extending it to people who have wronged you is not weakness. It is the hardest and most important form of strength there is. Kyle listened to everything. He was that kind of child, the kind whose attention costs them something, who does not absorb what you say passively, but processes it, questions it, tests it against what he already knows, and files it somewhere real. He also grew in ways that Maeve watched with close, careful attention. From the time he could walk, animals approached him without hesitation. Not just the domestic animals of the village, the working dogs, the horses, the mountain goats that everyone knew, but the wild ones, the foxes that kept a careful distance from human settlements, the great gray wolves that moved through the high passes and were heard in the night but rarely seen. They came to him, they sat near him, they watched him with a quality of attention that no one in the village had words for. Maeve had words for it. She simply kept them to herself for a while. The markings appeared gradually, beginning when Kyle was perhaps 2 years old. Faint silver lines along his forearms, barely visible in ordinary light, but unmistakable in full moonlight, tracing patterns that Maeve recognized from drawings in the oldest books she owned. Bloodline marks, the signature of the Moon Guardians, the ancient compact between the royal line and the wolves who had protected this territory for centuries before kingdoms had walls. Most children born to the line carried the latent version of these marks. They remained dormant, decorative at most. Kale's marks moved. Subtly, yes. Not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would notice. But when he was frightened, they brightened slightly. When he was calm and focused, they settled into something almost rhythmic. When he was near the wolves, they pulsed. Maeve told Elara about this on a night when Kyle was asleep and the fire was low. She laid it out simply, without embellishment. The compact, the bloodline, the thing that was supposed to happen every few generations, a child born in specific circumstances, marked more deeply than the others, serving as something between a bridge and a key. A moon guardian in full, not symbolic, not ceremonial, actual, a person in whom the old compact between the kingdom and the wild was renewed and made functional again. He can protect people in ways that armies cannot, Maeve said, if he is allowed to become who he is. And if he is not, Maeve was quiet, then the compact breaks, the wolves withdraw, and the kingdom, whatever remains of it, faces what comes next entirely alone. Elara sat with that for a long time. What comes next? She finally asked. There is an enemy beyond the eastern ranges who has been waiting for the compact to break for 40 years, Maeve said. They have been patient. They are not, by nature, patient people. Which means they have wanted this badly enough to learn patience specifically for this purpose. She let that sit. Then, General Valor has been in communication with them for over a decade. The fire crackled. Outside, the night was absolutely still. He never wanted just the kingdom's wealth, Maeve continued. He wanted to deliver it. The alliance, the wolf compact, the bloodline. If all three are severed simultaneously, what remains is a territory, not a kingdom, and territories can be absorbed. Elara stared at the fire. He planted the evidence against me to remove the one person in the palace who had accidentally learned the truth. Yes. And Lucien, she stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Maeve nodded. The king was the instrument, not the architect. That does not absolve him, but it is the truth of it. Elara pressed her fingers to her temple. Kyle can never know any of this until he is ready. He will be ready sooner than you think. He is 5 years old. He is 5 years old today, Maeve said. He will not be 5 years old forever. Meanwhile, back inside the palace walls, the kingdom king Lucien had so fiercely protected was beginning to show the cracks that Valor had spent years carefully creating. The first winter after Elara's exile, the harvest reports came back lower than expected. The council attributed it to unusual weather. The second winter, 3 trade agreements collapsed within the same month. The council attributed it to difficult negotiations and promised to resolve it. The third winter, the first rumors of military movement beyond the eastern ranges reached the palace. The council called them exaggerations. By the fourth winter, the word crisis was being used in closed-door meetings, though never in public announcements. Lucien felt it before he fully understood it. The slow, cold recognition of a man watching something he built deteriorate in ways he cannot precisely identify, cannot attribute to any single decision, cannot locate the origin of no matter how many maps and reports and advisor meetings he attends. It felt like rot. The kind that begins somewhere you cannot see and spreads outward until the surface gives way beneath your feet without warning. He slept poorly. He ate less. He spent hours in the war room studying maps of territories and routes and border positions, searching for the logical explanation that would give him something to push against. And in the quiet moments, the ones he had trained himself not to have too many of, he thought about her. Not with the dramatic force of romantic longing, with the quieter, more persistent ache of a man who had done something that could not be undone and had been living in the aftermath ever since, pretending the shadow of it was simply the normal weight of leadership. He had sent a patrol into the northern forest 6 months after the exile, officially to check the boundary markers. He never told anyone, not even himself, fully what he had actually hoped they might find. They returned with news that silenced him for 3 days. Blood in the snow 3 miles beyond the gates, signs of struggle or collapse, no body, no trail continuing beyond a certain point. The official record noted it as evidence of an unfortunate outcome. Lucien had stood alone in his chambers with that report in his hands for a very long time. He did not cry. Kings are taught not to. But he stood there long enough that the candles burned low and the fire needed tending, and the guards outside the door exchanged uncomfortable glances and decided not to disturb him. He put the report in a locked drawer and did not return to it for 2 years. But he never forgot what it said, and the guilt of it, quiet, constant, impossible to fully outrun, settled into him like winter cold into stone. It changes the stone, eventually, not all at once, slowly. The event that changed everything began not with a battle, but with a conversation beside a fire. Kyle was 9 years old. He had spent the day helping one of the village families repair storm damage to their roof, working alongside adults twice his size with the uncomplicated willingness of someone who does not think about whether a task is beneath him, who simply sees that it needs doing and does it. He had come home with splinters in his palms and dried mud on his knees and the satisfied tiredness of real physical work. And he had eaten dinner without talking much, which was unusual for him. After the meal, after Maeve had retreated to her corner with a book and the fire had settled into its lower evening rhythm, Cale looked up at his mother. "There are refugees on the South Road," he said. Elara set down the cup she was holding. "How many?" "Many. Families. A woman had a baby that was sick. I gave them what food I had in my pack." He paused. "They said the capital is burning." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Not burning literally, not yet, but burning in the way that things burn before the flame, with the accelerating heat of desperation, the smoke of collapsed systems, the smell of something that cannot be repaired through ordinary means. Kyle continued. "They said the king cannot stop it. They said the warriors are demoralized, and the food stores are almost empty, and the enemy armies are 3 days from the outer walls." He looked directly at his mother. "They said the moon goddess has abandoned the kingdom." Maeve turned a page of her book without looking up. Elara said nothing. "Is it true?" Kyle asked. "The situation is serious," Elara said carefully. "It has been building for years." "Whose fault is it?" A long pause. "Many people's," Elara said. "Some through cruelty, some through fear, some through silence when silence was the wrong choice." Kyle studied her. He had his father's eyes, silver gray, direct, the kind of eyes that do not accept surface answers. "You know more about this than you tell me," he said. "Yes. I am not a child anymore. You are 9. The families on the South Road had children younger than me helping carry the weight." Maeve turned another page. The fire crackled. Elara felt the moment, had been feeling its approach for months, really. The moment she had been building toward and dreading in equal measure for every one of the 9 years since she had walked out of those palace gates alone. She looked at her son, at the silver marks faintly visible on his forearms in the firelight, at the wolf pendant around his neck, a piece she had kept from the night of her exile, the only material thing she had carried away from her life before. She thought about the woman who had been dragged across a frozen courtyard and what she would have done differently if she had known what would follow. She would still have stayed silent, not out of cowardice, out of love for the child who was not yet born, but was already more important to her than anything the palace had ever offered. But Kyle was born now. He was 9 years old and asking questions with silver eyes that already knew they were being given incomplete answers. And the kingdom, the flawed, frightened, failing kingdom that had chosen Valor's lies over her truth, was collapsing in ways that were going to hurt people who had nothing to do with any of it. Ordinary people. Children on the South Road with sick babies and nothing in their packs. She began talking. She told him everything. Not the way you tell a child a story, with softened edges and simplified motives and conclusions designed to be manageable. The way you tell a person something real. The love first, because he deserved to know his origin was love, however broken the conclusion. The change in the king, the slow wearing down of a man by pressure and fear, and people who understood exactly which words to use to make pride feel like wisdom. The night she heard Valor in the lower gallery, the evidence, the exile, the storm, this cabin, Maeve, the marks on his arms and what they meant, the compact, the enemy beyond the ranges, the man responsible for all of it, still standing beside a king who trusted him more than he had ever trusted the person who actually loved him. Kale listened without interrupting. His face moved through things she watched carefully. Surprise, grief, the particular expression of someone reorganizing their understanding of their own life around new information. The way you reorganize a room when you discover the walls are in different places than you thought. When she finished, the fire had burned low. The cabin was very quiet. Then Kyle asked a question she had not expected. "Does he know I exist?" "No," Elara said. "He thinks I died with you." "Yes." He was quiet for a while with that. "Then everything that has happened since, the famine, the collapsing alliances, the enemies, he has been facing all of that, believing he lost everything." Elara frowned slightly. "He made his choice." "I know," Kyle said. "I am not saying he did not deserve consequences." He turned to look at the fire. "I am saying consequences arrived, and they are arriving now for people who had nothing to do with his choice." He touched the wolf pendant around his neck. "The families on the South Road did not exile you. The children with sick babies did not choose. Valor, the villages burning at the eastern border did not plant the dagger in your room." Elara's throat tightened. "Kale, I am not asking for permission," he said. Not aggressively, simply stating the fact of what was happening inside him. "I need to go." Elara looked at her son for a long, silent moment. Maeve set down her book. "The tide," she said simply. Kyle turned to her. "You knew this was coming." "I knew the shape of what was coming," Maeve said. "I did not know the exact day." "Is this it? The moment in the prophecy?" "No prophecy tells you which moment is the one," Maeve said. "You feel it." She looked at him calmly. "Do you feel it?" He pressed a hand flat against his chest. The marks on his forearms brightened. "Yes," he said quietly. Elara pressed her fingers to her eyes. Then she lowered her hands and looked at her son. Truly looked at him, the way you look at someone when you are trying to memorize them because the world is about to change and you need something fixed to hold on to. "If Valor recognizes the pendant, then the truth comes out faster," Kyle said. "He will try to stop you." "I know." "The king may not believe who you are." "I know. And her voice caught. "I cannot go with you." Kyle crossed the space between them and took her hands in both of his. His hands were already large for 9 years old, capable hands. The hands of someone who had spent years learning the difference between holding something gently and holding it strongly, understanding that those are not opposites, that real care requires both. "You already saved me," he said. "You saved me the night you walked out of those gates. You saved me every morning you chose not to teach me to hate." Her tears fell quietly. "I am not a good person for what I raised," he said. "I am a good person because of it." He left the following morning before dawn. Just the cloak, the pendant, and the quiet, grounded certainty of a boy who had been prepared not with weapons or political education, or the particular social armoring that royal children typically receive. He had been prepared with something older and ultimately more durable. The genuine knowledge of who he was. He walked for 3 days through the mountain paths and the forest roads, and wherever he passed, things happened that he barely noticed, but that the people around him found remarkable. Wolves appeared at the edges of roads and watched without threat. A group of bandits who had been preying on the refugee columns turned and left without explanation the night he camped near their usual territory. A village elder whose fever had not broken in 2 weeks improved dramatically the morning after Kale spent time near the community fire, talking with the frightened families gathered there. He did not perform these things. He did not announce himself. He simply moved through the world as himself, and the world responded to that. He reached the capital on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The city looked like a place in the final stages of deciding whether to survive. The outer market had the shrunk-down, careful quality of commerce conducted by people who are not sure what tomorrow holds. The streets were not empty. If anything, they were too full, crowded with the displaced people of the outer settlements who had moved toward the capital walls for safety and were now discovering that safety is more complicated than proximity to stone. Kale moved through it without a plan in the formal sense. He did not present himself at the gates with a declaration. He did not seek out the palace. He simply began doing what he had always done. He found the places where things were needed, and he provided them, not from a storehouse or a treasury, but from the fact of his presence. He helped an elderly man whose cart had lost a wheel in the central road, blocking traffic while the crowd grew irritable around him. He sat with a group of children whose parents were occupied with the endless administrative nightmare of refugee registration, keeping them calm and entertained and not underfoot in a corner of the square. He gave his last food to a young woman holding a baby who had not eaten in a day. People noticed him, not in the way they would have noticed someone announcing himself, in the way people notice the particular quality of a person who is genuinely present, who is actually there, inside the moment, attending fully to what is in front of them. "Who is that boy?" started as a question asked in passing. Within a few hours, it had become a conversation in multiple parts of the city simultaneously. "He has the king's eyes." "He handled those frightened horses outside the eastern gate without touching them. They just settled." "He does not have the accent of the capital or the north. He has no accent at all." "Did you see the markings on his arms when his sleeves rolled up?" In the palace, a messenger arrived with the information about a boy from the mountain roads who had apparently prevented a raider attack on one of the outer settlements using methods that the surviving witnesses were having difficulty describing coherently. "They say wolves came," the messenger reported breathlessly in the council chamber. "Dozens of them. They did not attack. They surrounded the settlement and the raiders simply left." The council chamber went quiet, then erupted. Vylor's face, in the chaos of that moment, was very carefully composed, but not carefully enough, because Lucien, watching from the head of the table, noticed, for perhaps the first time in years, something in his most trusted advisor's expression that did not match the words coming out of his mouth. A very specific kind of alarm. The kind that belongs not to a man encountering new information about an unknown figure. The kind that belongs to a man recognizing something he thought he had eliminated years ago. Kyle was in the lower market the following afternoon when the assassins found him. He had been helping stack grain sacks for a merchant family. Straightforward, physical work. The kind his body moved through easily while his mind processed everything he had been absorbing about the city. The shadows came from 3 directions simultaneously. Professionals, men who had done this kind of work before and understood the geometry of it, the triangulation that reduces a target's options, the moment of maximum exposure, the brief window before the target can fully react. They had silver blades, specifically silver, because someone had told them exactly what they were dealing with. Kyle felt them before he saw them, a warmth along his forearms, a shift in the air, a sound from a nearby alley, not the sound of approaching footsteps, but the sound of the 3 heartbeats that belonged to those footsteps, which he had only recently begun to understand. He could distinguish when he was paying close enough attention. He moved. Not away. He did not have room to run, and running was, in any case, not his instinct. He moved to the center of the open space, into the light. The marks on his forearms lit silver, not the faint, fluctuating glow of ordinary moonlight. Bright, clear, like something answering a call that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The 3 assassins emerged from the shadows simultaneously and stopped, because from the alley, mouths around them, from the spaces between stalls, from the rooftop edges, from the streets feeding into the square, wolves appeared, not running, not snarling, standing, still as statues, watching. The silver light from Kyle's arms reflected in dozens of pairs of eyes around the perimeter of the square. The nearest assassin raised his blade. A single wolf moved 2 steps forward. No sound, just the deliberate repositioning of an apex predator, communicating that it has made a decision. The blade lowered. Then the soldiers arrived, palace soldiers, running hard from the northern entrance, their captain shouting for the square to clear. And behind them, at the entrance of the market square, on foot rather than mounted, without fanfare or ceremony or any of the visible apparatus of his authority, King Lucien. He saw the wolves first, the sheer number of them, the way they covered every exit, the quality of absolute controlled stillness they embodied, the fact that the market crowd was pressing back against the walls in fear while none of the animals had moved aggressively, registered as something deeply outside his understanding. Then his eyes moved to the center of the square, to the boy, the marks on the boy's forearms, the wolf pendant at his throat, the silver of his eyes. Later, in every account that anyone who was there would give, they would all describe the same thing happening to the king's face in that moment. Not recognition, exactly. Something prior to recognition. The way the body knows something before the mind will allow itself to know it. The sudden suspension of the practiced composure of a man who had spent years mastering, not showing what he felt. He walked forward. The wolves parted for him. He stopped 5 feet from the boy. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted, in the memory of everyone present, far longer than the actual seconds it occupied. Then Lucien said, very quietly, "What is your name?" "Kyle," the boy said. The king looked at the pendant. "Where did you get that?" "My mother gave it to me." A pause that contained, somewhere inside it, the total weight of 5 years. "What is your mother's name?" "Elara." The word moved through the assembled crowd in a wave of sound. Half of them too young to know why it mattered. Half of them old enough to go completely still. Lucien's face did something uncontrolled, just briefly. The kind of involuntary rupture that happens when something a person has been holding at careful distance for years suddenly has no distance left between them. He had believed she was dead. He had believed every day for 5 years, that his decision had killed the woman he loved and the family he had never let himself fully acknowledge he had wanted. He had believed his pride had taken something from the world that could never be returned. He looked at this boy, at the eyes, the marks, the pendant, the quality of absolute composure and lack of accusation in the face looking back at him, and understood that he had been wrong about all of it. Not entirely. He had still exiled her. She had still suffered. The wound of it was real, and the consequences of it were real. But she was alive. And this boy, his son, who had walked into a city collapsing under the weight of his father's failures, and immediately began helping strangers. His son, who was standing in the center of an assassination attempt with absolutely no fear on his face. His son, who had clearly been raised to be everything the kingdom had forgotten how to be. The moment was broken by a sound, steel on stone. General Vylor had drawn his blade. He had positioned himself during the exchange, moving quietly, using the commotion of the crowd and the king's fixated attention, getting within striking distance with the controlled patience of a man who had been calculating moments of vulnerability for decades. "You should have died with your mother." The words came out in a voice stripped of its usual performance. No warmth, no counsel, no pretense of loyalty. Just the naked sound of someone who had been planning something enormous for a very long time and could see it collapsing before their eyes. The crowd went absolutely silent. The wolves did not move. They did not need to, because every person in that square, everyone within earshot, every palace soldier, every frightened refugee, every merchant and child and elder pressed against the walls, had just heard a direct confirmation of what the evidence had never conclusively proved. The general's own words, the ones that told the story in their entirety. "You should have died," meaning he had arranged for that to be the outcome, meaning her exile had not been justice, meaning the dagger, the witness, the evidence, all of it had been architecture, his architecture. Vylor understood what he had done the moment the words cleared his mouth. He was good enough to understand it immediately. He turned toward the exits. The wolves shifted. Every gap closed. He turned back. Lucien was no longer looking at his son. He was looking at the man who had stood beside him for 20 years. "Arrest him," the king said. It was not said loudly. It did not need to be. The soldiers moved. Vylor raised his blade. 2 wolves sat down directly in his path. He dropped the blade. The silence that followed was total. And then, into that silence, Lucien did something that no king in the recorded history of that throne room had ever done in public, in front of soldiers and civilians and refugees and merchants and children. He turned to face the assembled crowd, and he told the truth. "I failed this kingdom," he said. His voice was steady. It cost him everything to keep it that way. "I failed the woman I loved. I failed a child I was never given the chance to know. I made a decision driven by pride and by fear of appearing weak, and I convinced myself that strength without vulnerability is still strength." He paused. "It is not. I know that now. I have spent 5 years watching everything I built deteriorate and not understanding why I could not stop it. I understand why now. Because a kingdom built on fear instead of trust will always collapse when the fear is not enough. And because I allowed a man I trusted to replace the truth with something more convenient for his purposes. And I did not question it because I was afraid of what the truth would cost me." The square was perfectly still. A child, somewhere near the back, began to cry. Not from fear, but from the particular overwhelmed emotion that children experience when they feel something enormous happening without fully understanding it. Lucien turned back to his son. Kyle had not moved. He had listened to everything with the same focused attention he had given his mother the night she told him the truth. The same silver eyes, the same lack of performance. Just a person, fully present in a moment that required everything. "I do not have the right to ask anything of you," Lucien said quietly. "I understand that." Kyle looked at his father for a long time. Then he said, "You have the right to be better going forward. That is always available to anyone." Something in Lucien's face shifted. Not relief, not yet. The road back from what he had done was not measured in moments of recognition, but in years of changed behavior. But something. The first dim warmth of a fire being started after a very long winter. The weeks that followed were not tidy. Nothing about genuine change is. The enemy forces that had been approaching from the east withdrew, not because of a military victory, but because the wolves, under Kale's presence, moved to the borders in numbers that no military intelligence report had predicted or accounted for. The ancient compact, alive again in the person of the child it had been building toward for generations, functioned in the way it had always been intended to function, not as a weapon, but as a statement. This territory is not unprotected, not by the king alone, by something older. Vylor's trial took 3 weeks and revealed the full scope of what he had constructed over 20 years. The alliances he had sold, the famines he had engineered through careful trade manipulation, the military schedules he had shared, the witness who had testified against Elara and who came forward during the trial with a face that showed what it costs a person to carry a lie for half a decade. The legal proceedings were exhaustive and ultimately complete. The verdict was not. Because accountability for the king was not a matter of external judgment. It was a matter of the internal reckoning a man does when there is no audience and no one left to perform for. Lucien traveled north alone, on horseback, with no escort, on a morning when the season was beginning its first tentative turning toward something warmer. He found the cabin without difficulty, which was, he would think afterward, its own kind of message. Maeve was standing in the doorway when he arrived. She looked at him with silver eyes that assessed without judgment, the gaze of someone who already knows the story and is simply checking that the person living it has caught up. She stepped aside. He dismounted. He walked through the door. Elara was at the fire. She turned. They looked at each other across a room that contained everything that had happened and everything that might still happen, and the entire unbridgeable and somehow bridgeable distance between those two things. She had not aged the way someone sheltered and comfortable ages. She had aged the way someone tested and survived ages, with a quality of solidity, a groundedness that was not hardness, a calm that had been earned from the inside out rather than imposed from the outside in. She looked, Lucien thought, like someone who had discovered exactly who they were and had decided to be that person without apology. He lowered himself to the floor, not a calculated gesture, not a performance of humility designed to achieve forgiveness. His knees simply went because the weight of what he had done and what it had cost and what was standing in this room, alive, present, and looking at him without hatred but without pretense, finally exceeded what any amount of practiced composure could hold. I was wrong, he said. 3 words. The most difficult 3 words available in any language. Elara looked at him for a long time. You chose your pride over your family, she said. Yes. You chose the opinion of people who did not love you over the truth of someone who did. Yes. And because of that choice, I gave birth to your son alone in a cabin in the middle of a winter storm. And I raised him without you, and he grew into something remarkable in spite of everything. But that does not make the years he deserved a father and did not have them acceptable. No, Lucian said, it does not. A long silence. Snow had begun to fall outside. The fire crackled. I cannot give you those years back, he said. I know that. I am not here asking you to pretend they did not happen. I am here because I need you to know that I understand, fully, without reservation, without any remaining illusion about my own part in it, what I did and what it cost. He looked up at her, and because whatever comes next, I want it to begin in truth. Elara was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, Kyle asked me last week whether forgiveness is the same as trust. Lucian waited. I told him they are not the same thing. Forgiveness is a door you choose to open so that the weight of the past does not crush the present. Trust is built slowly, from evidence, over time. She paused. He said that sounded right. She looked at the man kneeling in front of her. I am not telling you I trust you, she said. I am telling you that the door is open. The months that followed were the beginning of a different kingdom. Not perfect, not immediate, not the kind of transformation that stories sometimes pretend is possible in a single dramatic moment, but real. Lucienne changed the laws that had allowed fear to accumulate at the top and flow downward through every tier of governance. He rebuilt the council with people selected for wisdom and honesty rather than for the willingness to tell him what he wanted to hear. He expanded the supply systems to the outer villages not as charity, but as infrastructure, because a kingdom is not its capital, and leadership is not the people at the center. It is every person from the edge to the middle. He began asking, in every major decision, a question Kale had taught him without meaning to, simply by the way the boy lived. Who is not in this room that should be? The trade routes recovered, the villages rebuilt, the harvests improved, partly through better management, partly through the fact that when people are not afraid, they invest, and investment produces things that fear never can. Kyle moved between the mountain village and the capital, not abandoning one world for the other, but inhabiting both, which was, Maeve had told him, exactly what the compact required. Not a king, not a warrior, a bridge. He was not perfectly suited for court life. He had no patience for the performance of it, the elaborate political theater, the careful maintenance of appearances, the art of saying things without saying them. But he had something the court had been missing for years. He said things as they were, not cruelly, not without tact, but without the particular dishonesty of saying something designed to achieve an effect rather than communicate a truth. People found it alternately refreshing and unsettling, which was, roughly, the appropriate response to honesty in spaces that have been calibrated for pretense. Elara returned, not in the way she left, not dragged, not exiled, not defined by someone else's decision about her worth. She returned because she chose to, because the kingdom needed what she had always been willing to give it, and because the man who had once failed to protect her had spent every day since learning, slowly, imperfectly, genuinely, what protection actually means. She returned without ceremony, without announcement. She simply walked through the gates on a morning in early spring, and the people who saw her stopped what they were doing and looked, and after a moment, after the recognition settled, began to applaud. Not for what she represented, for who she was, the woman who had survived everything and come back anyway. Here is what this story is really about. Not kings or kingdoms or ancient compacts with wolves. It is about what happens when pride is mistaken for strength. Pride, the quiet, convincing kind, the kind that General Valor expertly cultivated in Lucienne for years, is not the loud and obvious arrogance of a man who announces his superiority. That kind is easy to see and easier to dismiss. The dangerous kind is the pride that presents itself as wisdom, the kind that says, I cannot be seen to be wrong. I cannot appear soft. I cannot let the people see that I made a mistake. Because once a person is living inside that particular story, every piece of contradicting evidence gets reinterpreted. Every voice that says, perhaps you were wrong, gets filtered through the question of what it costs to agree. And truth, simple, necessary, salvageable truth, gets exiled along with the people who carry it. This is not a story about a uniquely evil king. It is a story about an ordinary failure. The failure that happens when a person chooses the version of themselves they want to perform over the version they actually are. And it is a story about what survives that failure. Because here is what Elara did, and this is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. She walked out of those gates alone, in a winter storm, pregnant and discarded. And she did not become her wound. She could have. Every piece of that circumstance would have justified it. She could have raised her son on the fuel of her injury and sent him back into the world as a weapon. She chose differently, not because she was not hurt, because she understood, at a level below strategy or calculation, that the most important decision she would ever make was not what happened to her. It was what she did with it. She chose to give Kyle what the kingdom had refused her: dignity, compassion, the genuine experience of being seen as exactly who he was. And that choice, made daily, in small, ordinary moments, over 9 years of mornings and fires and questions and meals and stories, produced something that neither strength nor power nor military force could have produced. A person capable of walking into a collapsing kingdom and making people feel, for the first time in years, that there was a reason to hope. The king's great mistake was believing that what he lost was a person. What he lost was the compass that told him which direction to face. And when you lose your compass, you do not just wander. You wander with absolute confidence, because confidence is the one thing pride never runs out of in precisely the wrong direction, until something or someone stops you. Kyle stopped him, not with force, not with accusation, with presence, with the particular, undeniable authority of a person who knows who they are and is simply being that, completely, without apology or performance. The wolves came because the compact was real, but the people followed because Kyle was real. And the king changed because, when you look into the eyes of a child you abandoned, a child who has every reason to be broken and is instead offering you the most terrifying gift available to any human being, the gift of another chance, you are forced to choose. You can accept it, or you can explain why you do not deserve it. Lucienne chose to accept it. That choice did not erase what had happened. It never does. But it changed what happened next. And what happens next is, ultimately, the only thing any of us actually have control over. So now we want to hear from you. If you had been in Elara's position, walking out of those gates, knowing what she knew and carrying what she carried, what would you have done differently? And what do you think about the king's journey? Can a man who made a mistake that enormous, rooted that deep in pride, actually change? Or does the size of the failure set a ceiling on the recovery? And what about Valor, the man who engineered all of it? His story ended in a courtroom. But do you think he ever genuinely understood what he had done? Or was he simply a man who reached the end of his plan and found nothing inside it worth understanding? These are not easy questions. They are not meant to be. Because the stories that actually stay with us, the ones that surface in the back of the mind at unexpected moments, that reshape quietly the way we see the people around us, are never the easy ones. They are the ones that ask something of us. If this story asked something of you today, we would love to know what it was. Leave it in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. And if you are new here, if this is the first time you have found your way to one of these stories, click the subscribe button now, because the next one is already waiting, and it will ask different questions.